A mixture is not a chemical combining of substances. A compound would be where chemicals are chemically combined. In a compound, the atoms or molecules are chemically or physically combined so that the elements that make up the compound retain or lose their identities and do or do not take on a new set of properties. So let's break this apart. In a compound, the atoms, because compounds are made up of atoms, are chemically combined so that the elements that make up the compound lose their identities and do take on a new set of properties. A good example of this is that if you take hydrogen by itself and oxygen by itself, both of these are highly flammable, which is one of our chemical properties that we've talked about. But when you combine them together into a chemical compound, we get H2O. And we know that H2O is not flammable at all. So the property of water is very different than the two elements all by themselves. The smallest identifiable unit of a compound is what we call a molecule. And that would be like if you had just one H2O molecule. And it's made up of atoms, which are chemically bonded together. A mixture is always made up of a combination of elements. And that would be true and false. It depends. Everything in all matter is made up of elements. But mixtures can be made up of compounds, mixtures can be made up of elements, and they can be made up of compounds and elements. So in this case, the answer could be true and false. It depends on how you're looking at this question. In a mixture, the substances lose or retain their identities. So unlike question number 2, in a mixture, all of the parts retain their identities. In a mixture, you can separate everything, so nothing is going to change their properties. In a mixture, the substances involved can or cannot be separated by simple physical processes. So if you think back to the lab that we did, where you were separating a mixture, we can separate a mixture using simple processes. You can separate a mixture by using things like filtering. You can separate by boiling. You can also separate by freezing. So distillation and boiling, or freezing, are all ways that you can separate a mixture. In a compound, elements cannot be separated by a simple process because they are chemically bonded. So we could not separate a compound easily. True or false? An element can be broken down into a simpler substance, and that would be false. Elements are the smallest unit of matter. The smallest identifiable unit of an element is what we call an atom. So let's look at our list of substances here and circle the ones that are elements. Now we will know that it is an element because it will be on the periodic table. So for your test, you'll want to make sure that you look at your periodic table. If that substance is listed there, you know it's an element. Silver, that one is definitely an element. Water is not an element. Oxygen is an element. Air is not an element. Carbon dioxide is not an element. Hydrogen is an element. Gold is an element. Sulfur is an element. Alcohol is not an element. Carbon is an element. Sugar is not an element. Magnesium is an element. chromium is an element, nitrogen is an element, salt is not an element, and nickel is an element. Those were all found on the periodic table. Explain how to separate the sugar and water in a solution, and a solution is just a fancy word for a mixture of sugar and water. This is very similar to what we did in our lab. So in order to separate these two things, just replace this sugar for the salt that we had in our lab. So in our lab, we had salt water, but here you could separate the sugar using the same process. You could distill or boil the water, and when you distill or boil the water, the sugar will be left behind. How would you separate a mixture of alcohol and water? In this case, we have two liquids. So we can't use filtering and we can't use distilling or boiling because they're both liquids. In this case, they have two separate freezing points. So we could freeze them, and one would remain a liquid and one would be a solid, and you could simply remove the solid. And it would be very easy to remove from there. How could we separate sand and water? This is very similar to our lab. This one we could use filtration. Simply using the size of the particles. Please continue on to the next tutorial if you are having trouble identifying elements, compounds, and different types of mixtures.